Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar hosted by the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, OPANAL, following up the recognition for the winners of the first edition of the Antônio Augusto Cançado Trindade Award for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and led by one of our distinguished winners, Dr. Luis Rodriguez. This award was established in 2024 to commemorate the profound legacy of Judge Antônio Augusto Cançado Trindade, a beloved figure and tireless advocate for nuclear disarmament. His influence in the international sphere of law is undeniable. As a judge of the International Court of Justice and Inter-American Human Rights Court, he was a champion of the human right to peace and believed nuclear weapons to be wholly incompatible with the principles of international human rights. As a devoted humanitarian, he firmly believed that nuclear weapons represented an existential threat to the fundamental rights of human beings, both now and for future generations. The legacy left behind by Judge Antônio Augusto Cançado Trindade calls upon diplomats, academics, professionals, and members of the international community in general to advance the cause of nuclear disarmament and the pursuit of peace. In this spirit, member states of OPANAL recognized Luis Rodriguez and Elizabeth Mendenhall as the winners of the first edition award for their outstanding research in a piece entitled Nuclear Weapon Free Zones and the Issue of Maritime Transit in Latin America. To give you a brief background of Dr. Rodriguez, he is an assistant professor of international security and law at George Mason University, Scar School for Policy and Government. And he has continued to contribute his scholarly insights to Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation. With his work published in International Affairs, the Cambridge Review, the Third World Quarterly, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, among others. On this occasion, we're proud to honor a distinguished member of the academic community for his invaluable contributions to the scholarly recognition of nuclear weapon free zones. The Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, also known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco, established the world's first nuclear weapon free zone in a densely populated area. The conviction of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, as established in its preamble, lies on desiring to contribute towards ending the armaments race and strengthening a world of peace based on the sovereign equality of states, mutual respect, and good neighborliness, free of nuclear weapons. As part of this mission, through the agency, member states of OPANAL seek to support and promote scholars like Dr. Rodriguez, working to pursue the mission of peace ingrained in the spirit of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and seek to improve through their contributions the capacity and impact of nuclear weapon free zones. The call for the second edition of the Antônio Augusto Cançado Trindade Award for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation is already published. We invite you all to participate as we are accepting new submissions until October 15, 2025. Now, without further delay, I will give the floor to Dr. Rodriguez for his presentation that delves into the legal and geopolitical nuances of this Treaty of Tlatelolco, focusing particularly on the issue of maritime transit of nuclear weapons and its intersection with broader negotiations over the law of the sea. We will have an allocated time for questions and answer after the presentation, so you can raise your hand or put your questions on the chat. So, Luis, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Marta Mariana. Let me share my screen so we can start. Perfect. Again, thank you, Marta Mariana. Thank you also to OPANAL and the jury of the Antônio Augusto Cançado Trindade Award for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation for this recognition. It's truly an honor. And this is a paper that I co-wrote with my friend, Dr. Elizabeth Mendenhall, who is an associate professor in the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. And she is the expert on the law of the sea when it comes to nuclear issues. So much so that she's currently in the school boat in the middle of the Pacific, teaching for the Sea Education Association. And she's right now on her way to Hawaii without internet. And because of this, she cannot join us today, unfortunately. So I will focus my presentation on the Tlatelolco negotiations a bit more than on the law of the sea talks. Let me say, if you follow the news today, you know that we have experienced a lot of nuclear tensions recently, from Russian nuclear saber rattling in Europe, or the Pakistan and India tensions in Asia, to the Israeli-Iranian conflict in the Middle East. And while Latin America may seem far geographically away from all of these different nuclear problems, the region has a lot of experience dealing with nuclear challenges. This is especially the case because in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, a lot of different Latin American governments basically became acutely aware of the risks associated with nuclear arsenals and nuclear arms races. The historian Renata Keller has written a lot and has tracked all of the different responses to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there is this common and central idea that despite different risks or levels of threat, all of the region was basically kind of awakened to the risks of nuclear challenges. And to prevent some dangers in the region, a lot of Latin American states crafted a treaty constituting the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a densely populated area. And the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, commonly known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco, opened for signatures on February 14, 1967, and entered into force on April 25, 1969. And Tlatelolco institutionalizes restraints for non-nuclear powers, but it also institutionalizes commitments from nuclear powers. And other regions have used this nuclear weapon-free zone as an example of how to control the dangers associated with nuclear armaments. And a number of Latin American states have repeatedly introduced proposals to ban maritime nuclear transit, not only during the Treaty of Tlatelolco negotiations, but at other debates later on. In the Treaty of Tlatelolco negotiations, the United States argued that such limits would constrain its commitment to hemispheric security, and that it would also challenge its established norms on innocent hostage, which allowed transit that does not threaten the coastal state security. And the United States has been opposing such a ban since then. So the main question that guides our paper is basically, why did Latin American officials exclude such restrictions from the nuclear weapon-free zone, especially when a lot of countries in Latin America were pushing for such restrictions? And accounts focusing on great powers and the outcomes of international negotiations would basically posit that Latin American states came in to US presence, fulfilling this idea that great powers are the leading architects of governance mechanisms. And instead, we use an approach that is centered on historical context and on the negotiation process. And we argue that Latin American states basically bracketed the maritime nuclear transit discussion at Tlatelolco in attempts to resist US pressures on other topics. So rather than ignoring the issue of maritime nuclear transit altogether, Latin American states brought it back to the table during the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea negotiations, which started in 1973 on Clause 3. And to present the issue of bracketing, which is the main concept driving this paper, this is the plan that I have for today's presentation. I will basically give you a little bit of a theoretical overview of what the literature says on issue bracketing and the agency of the smaller states when it comes to negotiating responses to nuclear risks. I will present our own concept, and then I will give you the inputs. So let me start by talking about issue bracketing and arms control negotiations. And here, while Latin American countries led the Tlatelolco negotiations, they basically had to secure nuclear powers cooperation and commitments, especially because nuclear powers had to accept restrictions on their nuclear weapons deployment and testing in the region. And in this context, it would be easy to assume the nuclear powers became unofficial veto players at different moments, especially when they oppose various points or suggestions that Latin American countries wanted to introduce in the treaty drafts. So An approach focusing on great powers to study Tlatelolco would posit that nuclear armed states, especially the United States with its hemispheric nuclear monopoly, effectively vetoed the inclusion of certain issues in the draft of the treaty, such as maritime nuclear transit in the nuclear weapon-free zone. Instead, Dr. Mendenhall and I follow a more procedural approach to studying the negotiations. And we do this because collective compromise seeking and concession making permeate the codification of international law as a response to security problems. And the inherent characteristic of lawmaking kind of opens up spaces that developing countries use to challenge our asymmetries within treaty negotiations. And this is so much so that different international relations and lawmaking scholars have identified several tools that less powerful states can use to push for their preferences in negotiations, especially or even in those negotiations that are marked by power differentials. And these countries can increase their bargaining abilities through argumentation, threatening to end negotiations, using favorable voting and veto rules, and through issue linkage. And existing studies have done a great job at identifying all of these different mechanisms, but they tend to focus on the issues that are included on the agenda of negotiations. And we've drawn this literature to analyze why some issues get excluded from those agendas. And we argue that Latin American countries bracketed a divisive issue, in this case, limiting maritime nuclear transit, to form an effective common negotiating front during the codification of the regional nuclear weapons free zone. And by issue bracketing, we refer to a negotiating tactic that entails the deferral of a particular discussion to a different negotiation. Or in other words, we're talking about on purpose putting a controversial topic aside for consideration in a separate and upcoming process. And this tactic is useful because it discourages actors invested in the matter from using the issue to block discussions. And issue bracketing convinces these actors that are invested in these issues that they can address the issue eventually, perhaps even in a forum that might be more favorable given different voting or veto rules. And issue bracketing also reduces the burdens of making concessions to enhance the perception that a treaty is beneficial. So issue bracketing, in this specific case, help Latin American lawmakers form a consensus among themselves, allowing them to bargain with the United States more effectively and to resist US pressure on other more important topics for Latin American countries. And I know that all of this might sound a little bit too abstract. So let me move to the empirics in the paper to illustrate these claims. And I will start by talking about the Latin American position on maritime nuclear transit before the negotiations in Tlatelolco started. And here, Latin America has a unique history of cooperative contributions to developing the law of the sea. Since the 1940s, the expansive claims of Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru have played a catalytic role in shaping the evolution of the concept, for example, of territorial seas. And Latin American coastal states often sought to assure maritime states that freedoms of navigation would remain to gain support for their coastal resource claims. So in other words, if you help me or if you support, again, my claims over coastal resources, I will support your interest in keeping freedom of navigation rights. And maritime nuclear transit, despite this balance between the preferences of different states, gained a lot of importance when the United States and the Soviet Union made submarine launch ballistic missiles a central part of their nuclear strategies in the 1960s. Especially because nuclear armed submarines serve a key role as a secure second strike for deterrence strategies theories, because it could travel through the ocean without being noticed. And there was a lot of concern that Soviet nuclear armed subs could linger off the coast, leading the United States and its allies to place different technologies like passive acoustic arrays across maritime checkpoints to detect Soviet subs, including different hydrophone areas of the coast of Barbados, Panama, and even Puerto Rico. So to complicate things even more, or even more than these strategic considerations, Latin American countries also had very different views about the rights of coastal states. During the first and the second UN conferences on the law of the sea, there was no unified Latin American position, and domestic legislation defining the rights in special areas within those zones varied a lot from country to country in Latin America. So in this context of heightened strategic environment, but also lack of consensus among Latin American countries about the rights of coastal states, is when the Tlatelolco negotiations began. And I think that there is a common assumption when people study nuclear weapon-free zones that countries like those in Latin America get the nuclear weapon-free zone because they're either incapable of acquiring nuclear weapons because they don't have the technology or they don't have the knowledge, or because these countries agree so much on what to do about nuclear weapons and about the fact that they don't need them, that is almost automatic that they will have nuclear weapon-free zones. And we argue that those two assumptions are wrong. In Latin America, for example, countries like Argentina and Brazil acquire the knowledge and the capabilities to produce nuclear arsenals during the Cold War. So they have knowledge and capabilities. And also, in Latin America, the states had a common diagnosis about the dangers of nuclear arsenals, especially when it came to nuclear arms races. But they had contrasting positions on different issues during the Tlatelolco negotiations that could have potentially broken down this process. And maritime transit was a source of disagreement from the beginning of the negotiations. And there were a lot of discrepancies among Latin American officials on whether banning maritime nuclear transit should be a goal at all. On October 29, 1962, for example, Brazilian diplomats at the UN introduced a project to denuclearize Latin America, and they included a proposal to ban maritime transit of nuclear weapons. Later on, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador joined the Brazilian effort. The tensions emerged even among these four countries. Brazil and Chile wanted to forbid the maritime transit of nuclear weapons, but they could not persuade Bolivia and Ecuador to support them. So we see those tensions even in a group as small as these four countries. On March 21st, 1963, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and now also Mexico introduced an initiative at the UN reinforcing the goal of denuclearizing Latin America without explicit reference to banning maritime nuclear transit. And that is how we get to the beginning of the negotiations at Tlatelolco. And after the UN approved the creation of the Preparatory Commission for the Denuclearization of Latin America, OPANAL, in November 1963, OPANAL met for 4 sessions between March 1965 and February 1967 to negotiate the Treaty of Tlatelolco in the Tlatelolco neighborhood in Mexico City. So with this, let me delve into the negotiations at Tlatelolco. Once the Tlatelolco negotiations had started, a small but vocal group of Latin American countries, namely Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and Venezuela, urged to establish a ban on maritime nuclear transit. But this group, again, is just 4 countries. This group couldn't even agree on what term to use to push for this ban, especially because they couldn't agree on whether to use transit, transport, or passage as the activity that they wanted to regulate and prohibit. And in response, Mexican diplomats successfully insisted on excluding an explicit ban using either term. They argue that if the transporter was a state that was a member of the Tlatelolco Treaty, a state party, then the treaty already prohibited possessing these weapons. It was redundant to have this kind of regulation. Mexican diplomats also argued that existing international law and norms guarantee the state parties' right to allow or deny passage rights to non-signatories in the free exercise of their sovereignty. So for them, it was not necessary to have this kind of prohibition. Now, another problem also emerged because even if countries agreed to ban transit, and again, they didn't even agree on what term to use, the question then would be where to prohibit it. And there were major challenges associated with limiting the zone where such a ban would apply, especially because there was no definition of the term territorial seas during the 60s. The term gets defined later on in the 70s and 80s. And during the 60s, El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Paraguay, and Peru proposed the denuclearization of Latin American territorial seas. But when they did that, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru reacted by claiming that the treaty should not constrict their claims to their territorial seas because they had a different interpretation of what territorial seas meant. And negotiators, in response to these dynamics, reached a consensus on avoiding an explicit definition of the area that Tlatelolco would apply to. They established that the term territory included the territorial sea without an explicit definition of either territory or territorial sea. In response to this consensus, though, the United States complained about the vague definition of Tlatelolco's zone of application. And Mexico, the Mexican delegation, proposed that the article defining territory be reworded in a way that was a little bit more explicit in attempts to avoid or eliminate the US opposition. And this change would have forced negotiators to draft and include an explicit definition of territory and the territorial sea. And immediately when Mexico did this, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela rejected the proposal. And they argued that all delegations had agreed upon the vaguer definition of territory. And in the end, Mexican diplomats backtracked to avoid stalemating the negotiations. And the area of application of the nuclear weapon-free zone was defined with reference to degrees of latitude and longitude, and not in terms of territorial sea. And even if the negotiators of Tlatelolco could agree on the definition of transit and the delimitation of the territorial sea, the Tlatelolco negotiators would have had a hard time designing a mechanism to enforce a ban on maritime nuclear transit. So because of all of these different issues, this is how the zone of the Treaty of Tlatelolco application looks like. And it's different than other areas that have a much better defined concept of territory or territorial seas. Also, during the fourth and final session of COPREDAL, Latin American officials could not reach a consensus on either a definition of transit or the zone of application of a maritime nuclear transit ban. And rather than risking the failure of the nuclear weapon-free zone negotiations, Latin American states bracketed the maritime nuclear transit discussion, leaving the question of defining transit and also the question of defining the territorial sea out of the Tlatelolco talks. And they plan to address them during the negotiations in UNCLOS 3. And by bracketing this issue, Latin American states were able to form a common front to face the nuclear powers on other issues, such as guaranteeing their access to peaceful nuclear technologies. So after all of these different diplomatic gymnastics, the Tlatelolco Treaty opened for signature at the end of this fourth negotiating round. And now, for the sake of time, and since Dr. Mendenhall is, again, the expert on the law of the sea when it comes to nuclear issues, I won't go into a lot of detail on the Latin American attempts to limit nuclear transit in the law of the sea negotiation. So I will briefly talk about this. And the difficulty building consensus around military nuclear transit persisted after Tlatelolco ended and was carried out to the law of the sea negotiations. UNCLOS 3 cover, among other topics, all the maritime issues discussed during the Tlatelolco negotiations. And the new agreement was intended to be comprehensive, covering all ocean areas, all users, and all use activities, and would also supersede pre-existing international agreements on the same topics. So the stakes were very high. Because of this, it offered an opportunity for developing states to put forward their preferences, especially because UNCLOS 3 was supposed to be a package deal agreement. And this approach, a package deal agreement, combined with consensus-based decision-making, gave developing countries a degree of leverage over those negotiations. So again, issue bracketing works when you have another forum where you can move an issue to, but also when you can convince the actors invested in that issue that maybe the other forum has better negotiating characteristics. And by the 1970s also, a Latin American consensus started to emerge on coastal zones, especially around the idea that coastal states had a right to confront their maritime resources, to control the maritime resources and adopt regulations to protect their safety and security. So this was different than the opinion that countries had in the 60s about what to do about coastal states' rights. And Latin American states initially pushed for strong restrictions on military activities, including military transit in the territorial sea, and what would also become the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ. But Latin American countries were not the only ones that were pushing for this kind of restrictions. A lot of Arab states were also proposing these restrictions on foreign passage. Despite the commonalities, though, these countries didn't gain much support from other states, mainly because issues over resource rights, especially those rights in areas beyond national jurisdiction, were considered more critical for many developing countries. So if they had to push for one or the other, a lot of developing countries prefer to push for resource rights instead of banning maritime nuclear transit. So in the end, the Latin American coalition didn't find a lot of support from other regions. And also the Latin American coalition broke down during the UNCLOS negotiations. The inclusion of the EEZ, as well as the rules around continental shelves, represented a major victory for a lot of Latin American states because they wanted to maximize their control over coastal resources. So if they had to choose one issue over the other, they preferred to push for those rights of coastal states instead of banning maritime transit. And they didn't push for this kind of regulations, except for Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela, which were three countries very invested in having this kind of regulations on maritime nuclear transit. Now, since there were no parallel discussions in which states could debate a maritime nuclear ban, Latin American countries could not engage in issue bracketing again. And instead, they favored using ambiguous language on the definition of coastal state rights and duties. And this ambiguity was acceptable to maritime great powers, especially countries like the United States, because they preferred to avoid direct references in UNCLOS 3 to military actors or activities. These countries, again, the maritime great powers, assumed that without explicit restriction, military transit of any kind, even if it was not innocent, would be unrestricted in territorial seas. Now, a substantial number of the states had a different interpretation of ambiguity than those great maritime powers. They use it to justify requirements for prior notification and also requirements for authorization. And in some cases, even to require outright prohibition of maritime nuclear transit. And such restrictions have been applied to warships and those carrying hazardous cargo like nuclear waste, especially by the coastal states of Latin America and Southeast Asia. In general, such restrictions have not caused significant controversy until now, especially because maritime states will often seek other routes or will agree with the requirements of the coastal state. So even though Latin American countries couldn't engage in issue bracketing, they have used the ambiguity of these regulations to push for their own interpretation on what it means to have innocent passage rights. And with that, let me quickly conclude before going into the Q&A. So, with the Treaty of Tlatelolco, Latin American states renounced their prerogatives to build, acquire, and store nuclear weapons. But nuclear powers also committed to respecting the region's non-nuclear status and to provide negative security assurances, meaning I will never use or threaten to use my nuclear weapons against you, to the signatories of Tlatelolco. And the Latin American participation in crafting the regional nuclear weapon free zone did not mean that the region states share complete harmony of interests. While the Latin American states and nuclear powers shared common anxieties about nuclear risks, Latin American countries had very different opinions on key issues, such again as maritime nuclear transit, but also, for example, access to peaceful nuclear technologies, such as peaceful nuclear explosions. And nuclear states, especially the United States, opposed a lot of different proposals that were at odds with their own security preferences. So the Latin American negotiators also faced pushback from nuclear arms states. And this forced Latin America to embark on a laborious process of setting security priorities, crafting compromises, and securing the cooperation of nuclear powers. And after years of discussions, neither Tlatelolco nor UNCLOS include an explicit and direct prohibition on maritime nuclear transit. But Latin American states, again, have promoted an interpretation of these treaties in their attempts to produce a general practice accepted as law restricting maritime nuclear transfer. So, to conclude, Latin American concessions in making the Treaty of Tlatelolco, we argue, were not impositions from nuclear powers and did not result out of a harmony of interests among these states. Their compromises were strategic decisions that help Latin American countries promote their governance preferences and achieve a common practice or approach on how to regulate these different nuclear risks. And nature of bracketing helps us as analysts see how countries like those in Latin America have exercised their agency when they agreed to leave certain topics out of the negotiation agenda. And with that, I want to thank you again. I want to thank OPANAL in my own name, but also on behalf of Dr. Elizabeth Mendenhall for the great honor that it meant to receive this award. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez. It's always a pleasure to listen to your presentations and your research. I personally believe that it is very timely for us to reflect on your investigation and also the history on how Tlatelolco was conceived and also negotiated among member states. And it helps a lot to break these myths that are around the establishment of the zone and Tlatelolco regarding precisely what you said on your conclusions. That was something imposed by maybe the nuclear powers or that happened automatically because there were no nuclear capabilities within the zone. And completely frank with the audience also is something that we still hear from time to time, that there is something that happens automatically, but we can witness and we can now back up with your academic research that from the very beginning, Tlatelolco was conceived and born from this, what you call diplomatic gymnastic, but what is also the willingness from the member states that are now part of OPANAL and compose the zone to negotiate even though when they had different interests or different perspectives in order to sadly establish the zone and what nowadays is a contribution that has spread among different areas. Now, thank you very much. And without further delay, I'd like to open the floor and invite the audience to have this interactive discussion with Dr. Rodriguez. It's a very, very unique opportunity. I have Fernanda Arbizu raising her hand. So could you please unmute yourself and
hi, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for the presentation, Luis Rodriguez and to the OPANAL for this conference. And that is a pleasure to be here today. I wrote my question, and when you were talking about the merge of the Tlatelolco, I was thinking about that is the scenario, the international scenario of this when the Tlatelolco emerged. And my question is about whether there have been any changes or new mechanism within the Tlatelolco regarding international security in light of recent conflicts. As we know, there are new conflicts like what is happening in Israel and Iran, and the cooperation or the diplomatic relations that we have with any countries that the Tlatelolco have a new new changes or new mechanisms that can help or can explain the new global security needs. And that's all. Thank you.
That's a great question, Fernanda, especially because I think that there are different ways in which people interpret this kind of organization, especially because we tend to see them as like those big structures that potentially don't change, but also we tend to see them as big structures that will automatically keep existing. And I think that those two things are, one, wrong, but also two, dangerous. OPANAL has had different changes throughout its existence. Oh, the Treaty of Tlatelolco has had different changes throughout its existence, from changes even to the name of the treaty that enforces or that creates a nuclear weapon-free zone, but also in terms of the capabilities around it or the kind of partnerships that OPANAL, the organization that enforces the Treaty of Tlatelolco, has. On the other hand, these organizations don't exist just automatically. These organizations depend on the investment, not only in terms of economic resources, but also in terms of human resources from its member states. And what we have seen with the Treaty of Tlatelolco is a region that is invested, but we shouldn't take that investment for granted. I think that we should keep in promoting both the economic cooperation from member states, but also the education of the next generation of people that can work with OPANAL. And I think that is especially important to do in a context like the one we're having right now. Again, this is just in the past couple of years. This is a context where we are seeing nuclear armed states potentially fighting with each other. We are seeing the potential cooperation between nuclear armed states to fight other enemies. And we are also seeing the potential spread of nuclear arsenals, even in countries that don't have those nuclear weapons yet. But it's not the first time that we're seeing a scenario like this. Again, in the 50s and in the 60s, we also faced those kind of scenarios, and we thought it was going to be very difficult to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. And what the Latin American countries did with the Treaty of Tlatelolco was show how even those developing states, smaller states, weaker states, however you want to call them, have also agency when it comes to managing nuclear risks. So I think it's very easy to despair in a context like the one we're living right now. But we should remember that, one, we have these mechanisms. We have the example of these different negotiations. And we have also the example of the creation of these different mechanisms to deal with nuclear risks. But we shouldn't take them for granted.
Thank you so much. That is so clear.
Thank you for the question, Fernando. Thank you for the comprehensive answer, Liz. Well, yes, from the Secretary, I totally agree with that. There is Tlatelolco, and the agency established by the Treaty of Aupanal is an entity that has been flexible and has proved its adaptability through the times to respond to the international context, the internal and external challenges it has had, and particularly in these times, very important to remember precisely what you asked, Fernanda, the context, the historical context in which Tlatelolco was envisioned and negotiated. Another question, I don't see any hand raised. I don't know if we have on the chat. I think that I have Shizuka asking a question, and then Francisco, if you are okay, Luis, we will have both questions, and then we will open your answers. So, Shizuka, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. My name is Shizuka. I work for Armstrong Control Association in Washington, D.C. My question, thank you very much for your presentation. That was fascinating. My question is also relevant to, I think, somewhat the current situation, not specifically to Israel, Iran, but I have a question about whether maybe OPANAL or like a states parties to the Tlatelolco has had any discussion on the objectives and provisions of the treaty described in the treaty's text, and I assume it also appears on the protocols as well, because I think objectives and the provisions of the treaty tends to appear often in the nuclear weapon-free zones treaty's text, and maybe it might intersect with some maritime activities as well. I am very interested in the issue because I have covered some of the experts hold views about the Russian ICBM test that reaches to Kazakhstan, and also questions if the action would run counter to the objectives of the treaty. So very interested in hearing if states also have discussed what objectives and provisions are in detail during the agreement negotiations or formation phase. Thank you.
And Francisco, you can present your question, please.
Thank you, Marta. Francisco Parada from Oak Ridge National Lab. Thank you very much for the presentation, Luis. Just a couple of questions following up your talk. I would like to understand maybe from your perspective, from the legal perspective also, what is the OPANAL's point of view on transportable nuclear power plants, floating nuclear power plants? What's the relationship that exists or the contradictions that exist with UNCLOS on this kind of legal framework? And is there any discussions happening on maybe these connections or contradictions that exist between what the Treaty of Tlatelolco says and what is established under UNCLOS? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Before giving the floor to Luis, I'm just going to make a brief commercial. We also have, as part of the audience, several delegates that represent OPANAL member states, and Secretary General, of course, is present. So if anyone wants to join the conversation and complete answers, of course, that you're more than welcome. So now, Luis, please.
Thank you, Marta Mariana. And yeah, I also encourage everyone that is dealing, especially with the current context and the current discussions, to chip in, especially because as an academic, especially as an academic that works with historical materials, I'm very good at explaining what happened in the 60s and 70s, but when it comes to current messages, I'm limited by my access to a lot of these different conversations. So in response to Shizuka's question, for example, I can talk about what happened in the 60s when it came to the objectives of prevention of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Especially, as I said during the presentations, there were a lot of discussions, even heated discussions about what was the object and purpose, not only the provision, but object and purpose of the treaty. I'm very curious to hear from especially the OPANAL representatives in the room, if there have been any discussions recently about either reinterpreting some of the elements in Tlatelolco. I don't think there have been any discussions about amending the treaty to the new context, but I'm very interested to hear if there have been any discussions about those potentials, even especially, as Francisco is pointing out, the potential changes to the material context that we will see given new technologies, not only floating nuclear power plants, but also the potential proliferation of nuclear powered submarines, not nuclear armed, but nuclear powered submarines, or all of these different new technologies intersecting with the nuclear domain. So as an academic, I know that it's very difficult for treaties to change and adapt to new material contexts. And I'm also very interested to hear if OPANAL has been thinking about how to do that. Again, because as an academic, I know how difficult it is. So that was for Shizuka's question. For Francisco, I think that if I'm correct, there's an interpretation of both Tlatelolco and UNCLOS, especially UNCLOS, given how ambiguous it is when it comes to regulating some of the maritime activities. There is an interpretation that says that it's floating nuclear power plants are covered by the existing law. I'm not that convinced, especially because those interpretations could be very ad hoc depending on some of the situations. I haven't heard any attempts, for example, also out of dating UNCLOS or in the new biodiversity treaty in terms of regulating this new aspect. So I'm also very curious to see international society is going to potentially create new regulations or try to adapt the existing regulations for things like floating nuclear power plants.
Thank you very much, Luis. Just to complement, just mention and thinking about the question about the objectives and how to adapt the treaty and work within OPANAL. It's part of what you mentioned and this architecture in which the Treaty of Tlatelolco was built. It's the treaty, but then the treaty establishes the agency, and the agency, which is often as the secretariat, is composed by different entities. The General Conference, which is the 33 member states taking decisions, then the Council, which it rotates among the member states for election, but meets regularly every 2 months. This body from OPANAL meets regularly, and all these issues that might be regarding the context or new technologies are being discussed among the member states. OPANAL are the 33 member states, and the Secretariat supports the agency different activities. But that is how it's discussed and is part of this adaptability and leading work that is done by the member states day by day. I can see that we have another question from Martina. The floor is yours.
Hello, sorry, give me 1 second to turn on my camera. My name is Martina. I'm a student at the College of William & Mary, but I'm actively interning here at OPANAL, and I'm joined by some of my fellow coworkers and my interns, so it's really interesting to hear your presentation and interact with everything I've learned here so far. I really wanted to hear about your evaluation of issue bracketeering. Could it be an effective diplomatic tactic for establishing nuclear weapons free zones in more contentious regions, say Northeast Asia or the Middle East? Thank you again.
Thank you for the
If
question,
you're
Martina.
okay, we're gonna get another question. We have Florencia Renteria raising her hand. So,
good morning, everyone. I'm Florencia Renteria from Mexico and from Women in Nuclear Global. Thank you, Luis, for your great presentation. And I would like just to bring some visibility. If you could describe what could be, from your experience, some tips for a key negotiation in terms of a new treaty or extension treaty, because we know that there's a lot of concerns, not only regionally, but globally in the disarmament and non-proliferation industry, as well as the nuclear industry as well. Sometimes I feel there is not that much intersection with the nuclear industry because some common practices are not shared as it is with the disarmament area or nuclear security. And if you could describe maybe some cultural aspects and how you see the next negotiations probably in nuclear deals or new treaty zones for protection. Thank you.
Perfect. Let me take the questions as I got them. Martina, this is a great question, especially because I don't know. It might also be a little bit of a response to Florence. I think that I'm not sure if there is appetite right now to create new and big and comprehensive arms control treaties. So I don't know, for example, if issue bracketing would be that helpful, because for issue bracketing to be successful, Dr. Mendenhall and I identified the existence of a different negotiation either happening or about to start as a necessary condition for my negotiation to be successful. So if I know it's a country that I'm invested in an issue, that I can talk about that issue in this other forum that might be potentially be more beneficial for my own interest because it has, I don't know, better voting rights, then I'm okay not talking about it here. And I'm okay actually joining the other ones in pushing a common front for an issue that I care a little bit more about. If there are no other forums, or if there are no other negotiations happening, issue bracketing might not even exist. Now, though, I think that one of the main lessons from the Treaty of Tlatelolco negotiations in general is that just because something seems impossible in the current context doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I mean, back in the 50s and the 60s, it seemed impossible for developing countries with no nuclear weapons on their own to create this kind of regulations on nuclear anything. Because the idea was that it's only the nuclear armed states, because they are the ones that have to give up this kind of technology, they are the only ones that can have a say in nuclear governance. And Latin America became the example of, well, that's not the case. We can also do that. And as countries, we can also create these common fronts to push for our own preferences. So even if we think that the context is not propitious for all of these different negotiations to start, I would keep an eye out for these instances of innovation and creativity, which is what I see Tlatelolco as an example of. And it could also help in either the creation of new zones, but more than that, in the strengthening of new zones. So in the paper, we don't talk about all of the innovations that happen at Tlatelolco, but Tlatelolco also innovated in terms of when can the treaty enter into force. And in the case of Tlatelolco, for example, there was this change in the rules for entering into force of treaties by basically saying that you need just a minimum number of states, and then other ones can jump in and enter into the treaty. But the treaty would enter into force even if you don't have all of these other countries joining. And Egypt, for example, during the discussions about the zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, reference, a lot of the Egyptian diplomats have referenced the Tlatelolco example as an example also of how to create potentially a zone in the Middle East, by basically saying that it's not necessary for all of the states to be part of the zone at the same time for it to enter into force, that it can be open to signatures, it can even enter into force, and then other countries can join it. So we see a lot of those innovative components happening in Tlatelolco that have shaped or have helped shape discussions of other nuclear weapon free zones, but also other instruments. So now let me move a little more directly to Florence's question. Again, I think that, as I mentioned before, the scenario right now seems a little bit bleak for the construction of new agreements. What I'm interested in seeing is how we use the treaties that we have, or the legal instruments that we have right now, and how we adapt them and use them in this new international context. We have some new treaties, especially the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, for example, that have been embedded in this non-proliferation architecture that we already have. So I'm very interested in seeing how those pieces fit together and how states, but also non-state actors, are able to use those instruments that we have to face this current context. And then again, I would still keep an eye out for the potential of innovation. Because again, as I said, like in the 60s, we didn't expect this to emerge, and it happened. So I wouldn't totally discard the possibility of agency or innovation, even in a context as bleak as the one we're going through.
Thank you very much. I think innovation is one of the key points for the referendum in the future. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the questions. Last chance for the audience to ask before wrapping up. And just let me briefly, again, jumping into the answer and the question about the list, but again, taking everything back into the roots and this adaptability and purpose and spirit that the member states of OPANAL has shown throughout the time. Member states of OPANAL participate regularly at the process of the establishment of the zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And as Liz mentioned, there are different mechanisms that Tlatelolco has presented as an example for that and other zones for their own processes. Today we focus the discussion on the maritime transit aspect, but regarding, for example, the incorporation of other member states that have different concerns, Tlatelolco has also the example of the establishment of a BAC. Agency has the purpose on its own, but it's also complementary and another example of how the member states within Latin America and the Caribbean had presented this creativeness and different purposes, but in order to achieve a common goal. I don't see any other questions, so before closing up, I will give the floor to Victoria Vistondo. She is first secretary and representative of to OPANAL from Argentina. She has been coordinated the group for the award, the Antônio Augusto Cançado Award, and we're very curious.
Thank you, Marta Mariana. Thank you to the Secretariat. And on behalf of the Argentinian representation to OPANAL, we want to extend our sincere thanks to Luis for this outstanding presentation delivered as a part of the recognition for the winning work of the first edition to the Antônio Augusto Cançado Trindade Prize on Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. We had the honor to coordinate, as Marta Mariana remarked. And this insightful analysis has definitely enriched the discussion on regional security and reaffirmed the relevance of the Treaty of Tlatelolco in today's global context. So thank you very much, Luis, and thank you so much for giving us this opportunity and for all the audience for those amazing questions. And let's keep this space for further exchanges. And this is very relevant for the education for disarmament. So thank you so much to Luis and to the Secretariat.
Thank you very much. And well, before wrapping up and closing, this presentation is going to be posted in our social media, in our website, and in the YouTube channel of the Secretariat. And I also would like to reiterate the invitation to participate in the second edition of the Augusto Antônio Cançado Trindade Award for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. The rules and the call for applications are posted on the website, but if you have any question regarding this edition, you can always reach the Secretariat through the different channels that we have. Dr. Rodriguez is going to be part of the jury this year, and we have changed a little bit, the member states have changed a little bit the rules for you to be able to present your papers, but it is very important for the SON and for the academic boosting that the member states are doing right now. As was mentioned, and we have mentioned before, education and outreach activities are very important for the member states and have gained pivotal activities within the Secretariat. So you are all invited, and thank you very much for joining us today. We'll say goodbye now. Thank you, everyone. You will be receiving your certificate in the following days. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks.